okay? Just so you
I'm
know.
sorry?
Don't say anything terrible.
Oh, great.
No profanity.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Does anyone care if I move this?
Yeah, thank you. It was unnecessary.
Guys, I'm gonna move the water just so it's not
Quite in our way.
Same old candy dish.
We should really turn this on silent.
Do you know if there's like a flag that gets me?
Oh, I don't think so. We can keep like a phone up, like a timer.
No, in terms of just starting.
Oh, no, I think it's 9:30, so we can sort of start whenever and people can continue filtering in.
Should I
It's your
grab the
call.
door?
I can leave it in for a few more minutes and I'll ask Jake to close it.
So Dan, was that your review? Oh, okay. Heard of you.
I'm in New York.
Oh, you are? Where's the office in New York?
It's way downtown. It's like the water.
Okay.
Pretty close to the
Yeah.
fair.
Yeah. Interesting. So I'm from New York, but one of the tougher issues is the ACLU is some of the as they
There is both a card man
some
and
of the
adult man.
organizations. Yeah. When I was working for Florida, we were representing.
I think we might wait just a moment because our card guy left. He'll come back for us.
Some of the kind of the government.
Well, this is more than I expected for 9:30 a.m.
Looks like everyone from Magnolia shipped over here.
He was on the other side of the issue.
Oh yeah,
It's like,
I am
such an
quite the
interesting-
draw.
It's something that it's a tough one. It's a tough one. It's a really tough issue. Yeah. But it was I actually have to
Actually indulging in it.
I remember that was my first deposition. It was fascinating experience.
Your first deposition, just
As a lawyer, yeah.
and you're with the
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. 14 months. And so, what do you focus on?
I'm in technology.
I'm sorry?
Cut it off right.
I think we have someone who's gonna like flag us when we need to end because I think we seem to be running a little bit late, and based on yesterday, we're like 15 minutes late on everything. So, although to the extent that you guys, we seem to be running a little bit late, if you have a hard stop, just let us know because I certainly don't want to hold you all over and interfere with the rest of your days.
There's just like a natural end to the conversation, right? Immediately.
10:30 would probably be good.
I can probably make it work.
Mm-hmm.
And then also working with technique to think about some of these issues, content experience, so we're witnessing parts of the free software development.
Oh, cool.
Looking to a bunch of communities working on trying to improve the
So then
overall state of information security.
Good, sir.
people seem to be mostly settled.
All right. Thanks so much for being here. We're going to get this started. Here to talk about how cybersecurity information sharing programs can improve cybersecurity for everyone who's involved, government and private sector both, and the potential downsides of these programs. Cybersecurity information sharing is not a new concept. It was considered for years, but sort of has recently stepped into a brighter spotlight, in large part because of a series of high-profile breaches in the private sector and the government that affected a whole lot of people. Got a great group of panelists today to discuss and debate information sharing, voices from all sides of the issue. I've got some questions, but I hope they'll engage with each other as well whenever they want to reply. I'll introduce real quick and we'll get to it. Afterwards, we'll head to the spin room to see how they did. We won't do that. To my left is Josh Alexander. He's a professional staff member for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, where he handles cybersecurity and information technology issues. Josh previously worked on those issues at the Department of Defense, where he led the drafting of the Defense Department's first ever comprehensive cyber strategy. To his left is Robin Green. She's a policy counsel for the Open Technology Institute at New America Foundation, where she specializes in surveillance and cybersecurity issues. She helps research and develop policies to protect individuals' privacy, secure the internet, and fuel the development of and access to emerging technologies. We have Bijan Mathani. He's the Public Policy and Regulatory Counsel at the Computer and Communications Industry Association. He concentrates primarily on privacy and surveillance policies, cybersecurity, and internet governance issues relating to free expression and open networks. Bijan previously worked on these issues as a law clerk with Senator Dianne Feinstein's Judiciary Committee Office, PBS, and the Department of Justice. To his left is Jeff Ratner. He's currently Director for Legislative Affairs and Cybersecurity Policy at the White House National Security Council staff. Prior to working on the NSC, Jeff was the Deputy Chief of Staff of the National Protection and Programs Directorate at the Department of Homeland Security and Counsel and Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity to the Senate Homeland Security Committee Chairman, Joe Lieberman. Finally, we've got Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. He's a Technology Fellow on ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. Daniel participates in the development of Internet protocols for secure communications with the Internet Engineering Task Force. He has served on the leadership committee of May 1st People Link, a mutual aid organization for social justice advocates, and has led discussions on cryptography and data sovereignty issues at conferences from Banja Luka to Hong Kong. Thanks all for being here. Looking forward to our section. First question is for Josh, and it's about why we need information sharing legislation. Supporters of bills like the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, or CISA, which originated in your committee, invariably point toward an upward trend in cyber attacks and data breaches to show why we need information sharing between the private sector and the government. Can you tell us briefly, sorry guys, what information sharing is and whether it could prevent a massive data breach like the ones at the OPM earlier this year?
Sure, thank you for the question. Apparently I'm emitting radiation. Sensitive mic. Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to being on this panel. I think why we need information sharing legislation is on the one hand an easy question, and on the other hand a complex one. So I think that there is a broad understanding in many communities, in the technology community, the business community, that it is only through collaboration, well, I shouldn't say only, but it is often through collaboration that people are able to identify and address cybersecurity threats. And as the Congress has looked across the federal code over a number of years, as was mentioned, there's been two discoveries that have been noted. First of all, there's no positive legal authority for information sharing, which if you believe that it's a good thing is problematic. And the flip side of that same token is there's no positive legal obligations for how information sharing should take place. So we on the Senate Intelligence Committee, or I should say the Senate Intelligence Committee, has come to the conclusion that both of those things are important to put into place. And that's why the law was, or this bill, excuse me, was passed 14-1 back in March out of our committee, that there should be that positive legal authority and there should be those obligations to do things like protect privacy. To address the question about whether it would have prevented something like OPM, it's so very difficult to say that anything would have prevented something to kind of to prove that one way or the other. It may have, it may not have. It may have improved the response time. It may not have improved the response time. But what we've seen time and time again is those companies that have participated in information sharing programs have found them to be valuable. They've invested a lot of money. They have found that it has improved their security. So when we look at this bill, as Senator Feinstein often says, it is a critical first step, but it is only that, a first step. So it's not going to solve all the problems, but we feel as though it can give companies, individuals, security researchers the tools that they need to better address these problems.
Bob, and I wonder if you want to talk about how an information sharing bill would or would not prevent these sorts of breaches.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Very happy that you were all able to join us. As Kava had mentioned, we have been dealing with this kind of legislation really since around 2009. Some of you may remember debates about sort of kill switch legislation and stuff like that. Since then, this debate has evolved significantly. We no longer have talk about stuff like that because we understand how detrimental something like that could be to free speech and to the functioning of the internet. But we still think of this in the same frame as how is information sharing legislation going to affect internet use? How is it going to affect internet security? And the end result is, at least from OTI's perspective, we think that this is at best a 10% solution. And the reason for that is not because information sharing can't help, right? Obviously, having information about threats can be useful. Certainly, it's good for reacting to threats. If you know that someone else has had an attack and you might have a similar vulnerability, by having that information, you have the ability to respond to it. But here's the problem. A ton of information sharing is already going on. We have information sharing and analysis centers and organizations. We have major companies sitting on the floor of DHS's NCIC. We have major industries that are committed to sharing information with one another within the legal framework that exists today, right? And so when we are creating a law to further encourage information sharing, we have to do it with two things in mind. One, make sure that it's responsibly authorizing this kind of information sharing so that companies are not only committed to, but are in fact required to take active efforts to protect their consumers' privacy by removing any information that's not necessary to identify or respond to the threat, particularly when it's personally identifiable information. The moment that a company is not doing that, it's in fact increasing data insecurity. It's increasing the risk to their consumers because now it's not only holding that personal information on their networks, which may be insecure, but it's also being held other places, primarily with the government or with other private entities. And there's nothing in the bills that are currently on the table that would create data security and network security requirements for those entities, particularly the private entities that would be holding that data. And as we've seen from a lot of the federal breaches, the government, while it's trying, is not quite up to par. And that sort of gets us to the other problem. In addition to not really addressing the narrow problems of information sharing, where maybe there could be a narrow solution, notwithstanding any other provision of law, not saying that no laws apply and that you can share information so long as you follow a few very broadly drawn rules. We need to say, okay, here are the laws that are really the obstacles and create narrow carve-outs to them, and then do the other thing that we really need to do for cybersecurity. Take that other 90% step. Make sure that people, if they get the information, are responsible to act on it, to actually harden their networks. It can be costly, but it's immensely important. And then also make sure that they're doing those preventative measures that can actually prevent 90% of the attacks in the first place, updating their software, protecting data with encryption where that's reasonable, or two-factor authentication where that's reasonable, making sure that they're scanning for malware and viruses. There are so many things that we can be doing that wouldn't threaten but would rather significantly enhance privacy and data security. And it is OTI's belief that Congress really should be focusing on ways to incentivize those activities rather than creating broad carve-outs for information sharing that may have some impact, but there's nothing in the bill that would actually clearly lead a path toward that kind of cybersecurity enhancement. But it could really damage privacy.
Great. I want to talk a little bit more about the privacy issues that you brought up. Just co-sponsors, Senators Richard Burr and Dianne Feinstein, have said they've done pretty much everything they can to address the privacy issues in their bill. Last week in front of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, they said this. Senator Burr said, "I'm convinced today that we could put 10 more privacy protections in and the privacy community would not be satisfied." Feinstein said, "Some people you just can't satisfy no matter what you do," and I think to a great extent that's where we are. Dan, I wanted to ask you if you think that is where we are. Can you tell us what?
Sure. So I'm certainly not happy with the privacy provisions that are in the bill, because I think that the bill, as it's currently proposed, is actually seems likely to me to cause an increase in in the risks that people face in terms of data breaches. And I want to just explain a little bit about why that is, and why I think an additional privacy protection may not be the answer to make something like this better. So I'm a technologist, right? I work on software. I look at data systems. I want to understand how they work, and what the sort of risks they present. And one of the ways that you can look at the risks is you look at what we call an attack surface, right? You say, what's the data that could be breached? How could it be breached? Where is it available to be compromised? And I think that CISA, as proposed, goes in the wrong direction by removing any sort of liability from people who organizations who share data that could then be breached from, as Robin pointed out, now someone else is holding this data. That other organization could itself be breached. So you've actually increased the attack surface for whatever information you're sharing. And I believe that the privacy protections are saying, well, people don't need to share this data if they know that it's not relevant to the cybersecurity threat that they're trying to mitigate. So they might not, so that we have room for them to not share things that they think are important, to keep private for their customers. But we need to look at what is actually in the cybersecurity threat sharing that's going on. So currently, as Robin said, people do share information. There's an active security community that works on reporting vulnerabilities in software, that works on reporting what kinds of attacks are going on the network. These things are already happening, and there doesn't appear to need to be a legal carve-out, any sort of additional liability protection for people to do that, and we do it right now. But if your company is breached, you have a responsibility to the people whose information was breached. And if what you've been doing is pulling in additional data from your neighbors, or if you're the government, you've been pulling in data from the private sector, and you have another breach, well, now your liability should be increased, not decreased, because that breach actually exposes a bunch of people. But what if I, as an organization, decide, okay, so, sorry, I want to try to frame this again as an incentives question, right? If we say, as long as you share this information, you're not liable for having shared it. If we make these carve-outs to allow private sector to share information without being liable, then it's better for me as an organization, and this is a totally cynical mindset, but sorry, there are some organizations who are like, well, we got to do the cost-benefit analysis. It's better for me to share that information with somebody who I know has worse security practices than I do, because I know that the hackers are going to be going after the weakest link. So if the concern is that someone wants some information from me, well, I've now got a carve-out. I can share whatever I want. This bill can create an incentive to basically expand the attack surface for any of the data that is shared. So if we want to reduce the attack surface, we need to actually be encouraging organizations that hold large data stores to delete those data stores, or to delete the parts of them that they don't need. One of the reasons we have these issues is people just hoard data because it's cheap, and nobody's actually thinking about deleting data. So I'd like to see us instead incentivize data minimization and additional liability towards the people whose data you hold. And I think this goes about it in the opposite direction.
Josh, or maybe Jeff, I'd love to hear about sort of a response to this idea that there's redundancy in terms of, there's already ways to share information, and also this idea that there are more attack surfaces, that there shouldn't be more places to get at the data.
Sure. So I'll start really quickly. A couple points that were brought up, which are fantastic points, and ones that we've discussed at length in the committee. But I just want to clarify a couple things that are and are not in the bill. And people can have policy disagreements about the importance of information sharing or the risks or benefits that may cause. But first of all, the bill does include, and a number of companies were unhappy with its inclusion, a affirmative obligation for those who are engaged in cybersecurity information sharing to take security measures, specifically in Section 4D1 for anyone following along at home. Then, in addition, I think that there is a concern that has been raised about companies receiving information being breached and that being a way that information might be exposed. But I also want to clarify that the liability protection in this bill is only for those companies that are sharing information. It does not absolve companies' responsibilities to have responsible data security practices that they would otherwise have to have under law. So just because somebody raises their hand and says, if you'd like to share, I'd like you to share with me, that doesn't give them a get out of jail free card for any breach that they may have later. It's much the opposite. That if you are engaged in this system, you do have obligations under this bill, under this positive legal framework. If you're going to take advantage of it, you have responsibilities too. So.
I think one of the concerns, though, is it's not totally clear what those responsibilities are. I mean, when you think about the way that companies protect themselves, there is a bit of a cost-benefit analysis. It's how expensive is this going to be for me to implement versus how much return on that investment am I going to get, right? What's the potential loss from a cyber attack? And when you think about it in those terms, and then you look at the bill, while it does say that you have to take efforts to protect the data, it's not clear, what standards you have to meet. And one of the bigger concerns that we have in the privacy community is, this is putting a lot of the focus on information sharing and not on actually figuring out, like, what are those best practices for securing your data, and what are ways to get companies to actually start doing that. And I realize those are two separate issues, because on the one hand, we're talking about, sharing information about threats, and then on the other hand, we're talking about protecting against threats. But the overarching goal is enhanced cybersecurity. And I think that, when you address the digital hygiene issue, you get much more at that goal. If we can figure out a way, for example, to amend the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act to incentivize and protect security researchers rather than make them, frankly, feel threatened and have their activities chilled because they may be in violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, you would do more to enhance valuable threat data sharing than you would by creating large carve-outs for companies to share lots of data on any perceived threats. And so this sort of also gets to some of our concerns with the bill when it comes to the breadth of the framework and then also the privacy protections. I'm glad that you mentioned Chairman Burr and Ranking Member Feinstein's comments about the privacy community, because this is one of the things that no community as large as ours is always going to feel the same about every issue. And so to that end, I can only speak for OTI and myself. But I know I've worked with a lot of groups, and there are some groups who maybe they won't ever agree with information sharing because they think in principle it's not the right way to go. But there are ways to make the bill better. There are ways to make the bill more privacy protective. And this isn't something that would lead OTI, for example, to support the bill, because we have concerns about the overarching framework. As I mentioned, the authorization to share, notwithstanding any other provision of law, is very concerning. But if you were to raise the requirement to strip PII to ensure that any information that's not necessary to identify or respond to a threat was removed, that would really increase the privacy protections on the front end. It would sort of lift all boats, because then the concerns on the back end would be less. But as Josh mentioned, the companies don't really like that, right? It makes it much harder for them. They have to start making determinations about whether they're in compliance with that standard or not. But at the end of the day, if they're getting these large liability protections, they should be meeting the highest of standards. And then on the back end, it would be important to increase the privacy protections by doing a few things. One, making the bill more operational, effective and more civil liberties protective by ensuring that information is only shared through a single civilian portal, making sure that that civilian portal has the time and the capability to remove any information that's not necessary to identify or respond to the threat, and then making sure that if that cyber threat data is disseminated to other entities in government that need it to harden their networks and to protect themselves against cyber threats, that that data is only used for cybersecurity purposes and is not used for other unrelated criminal investigations and national security investigations. Right now, CISA doesn't offer those protections, and so it's critical that the bill be amended to ensure that if we're going to go down this path, if Congress feels that this is the necessary critical first step, that it do so in a narrow and responsible way, and that it also, frankly, do so with a sunset, that it make sure that Congress has a forcing mechanism to come back and reassess whether this is working, reassess what the implications are for privacy and for cybersecurity, and make sure that they can either allow the law to expire or make whatever tweaks that they need to make. But one thing we know is clear: Congress generally does not go to reassess legislation unless there is a forcing mechanism. I think many in the room have been doing a lot of talking about ECPA these last few days, weeks, years. And, you know, certainly there's a good example of a piece of legislation that needs to be updated, and it's taking nearly 30 years to get that done. Maybe if there was a sunset there, we would have gotten this done sooner. And so I would urge everyone to advocate for those types of limitations and those strong protections, regardless of whether they support the bill.
I just want to say one thing, and I think Dan raises an important point, and this actually goes to pieces of the two House bills that were passed. So we'll give Josh a pass for a moment. But and in those bills, there's a particularly problematic provision which immunizes companies that receive information under the sharing regime from acting on that information, which provides a really kind of perverse disincentive to and undermines the point of information sharing, really. If a company wants to go out and get as much cyber threat information as they can, but then is particularly protected from not acting on it, they have much more room to decide what's critical to their systems. Anything that may not be critical to their systems may impact customers, other vendors. Why would they share it if there's the threat of the possibility of liability for anything that may happen? And so that's a particularly troubling provision, which the administration's statement of administration policy highlighted as something that we would really need to see some improvements to before passage. But I think it speaks to one of the problems Dan was mentioning.
I wanted to jump in there actually on the liability protection issue. There seems to be a little bit of conflation about liability protection for sharing of information with liability protection for data breaches. I don't think any companies are seeking, at least none of my member companies, are seeking liability protection for breaches that happen on their watch for unreasonable commercial security practices. I think the goal here, and I think a limited sort of construction of liability protection for sharing information for antitrust concerns that might rise up, or for concerns perhaps with ECPA, which actually is designed to prevent the voluntary disclosure most of the time of information. That's where the concern is. And I think, yes, as Robin said, a sort of limited construction of carve-outs might be a better path forward, at least for some of the companies that I represent, rather than the sort of issue of, you know, are they being protected from general liability for breaches if they're negligent? I mean, I don't think anybody's looking for that.
Well, so let me just clarify, because I think maybe I was the one who introduced the confusion, and I didn't mean to. Sorry for that. I don't believe that the bill does provide general protection for data breaches for individual companies, but I do believe that once you start sharing your information with other companies, you're not liable for those companies' data breaches. You actually don't know what those companies' information security standards are. Maybe they meet some low bar that's provided by the bill. Maybe they fail to meet it, and they're in contravention. But now your customers' data can be breached because of these other companies who you've already shared data with. So yes, you may, as your company, you get the carve out for sharing, but your customer's privacy is not protected. And the people who you shared the data with, they have the data breach. Are they now responsible for contacting your customers? There's a set of open questions, like if there's a data breach, who are they liable to?
I think the concern.
And also we currently do information sharing, right? Many large organizations do share information. They share it with the U.S. government. The U.S. government coordinates security response. There's U.S. CERT. There's a whole bunch of different programs towards providing an improved cybersecurity slate of action for companies to take. And there are arrangements to ensure that these things do not fall afoul of antitrust, right? I mean, we all know that if the entire network is infested with malware, everybody is worse off. And so organizations, nonprofits, for-profits, government work together in order to improve the situation. We do that. So why do we need these additional carve-outs? There already is a practice of sharing, the important pieces of threats that are out there. Why do we need an additional liability limitation to allow us to say, okay, well, we're not liable for having shared this, when in fact what we've seen is that there have been organizations that have shared a lot of data with the government or with other companies in ways that they shouldn't have. And then now with these carve-outs, if this was enacted, you could say, oh, well, I was sharing it for cybersecurity purposes. And yeah, it happened to include a list of all of the times that all of the different login accounts happened. I mean, let's be specific about what is the data that's going to be shared here, right? What are some cyber threat indicators? Some of them are frequencies of login attempts from different IP addresses for different kinds of accounts, right? Because a bank wants to know, when is this account being cracked? That information can be really useful. It can be useful in all kinds of different ways, for business purposes or for surveillance purposes. And if all of a sudden I can say, well, I'm sharing it for the purposes of cyber threat, but there's no limitations on the use, and as Robin pointed out, there's actually no review or stripping of data.
Well, to be clear, there is actually some review, but it's not a high standard.
But there's forced immediate republication, right?
So basically, the way that it works in the bill right now is there's a requirement to review and remove personal or identifiable information on the front end if it's known at the time of sharing to be not directly related to the attack. The problem with this, though, is that, well, there's a few problems, frankly. First of all, the standard for review is non-existent. It just says there has to be a review. And so while I think it would be in bad faith, it still would not be outside of the scope of the legislation for a company to have thousands of pages of threat data that they want to share with the government, look at one page, say, oh, there's no PII that I know at the time of sharing isn't directly related to the threat, so I'm going to push the button and ship it off. As I said, that would be, I think, bad faith, but it would not be outside the bounds of the statute if this were to be passed into law as it's currently written. The second problem is with regard to when you need to remove information. So the bill says you remove information if you know at the time of sharing that it's not directly related to the threat. But the problem with this is that there's oftentimes information that's directly related to the threat that is still not necessary to identify or remove it. And especially when you have sort of a low standard for what constitutes a cyber threat. So right now under CISA, it's really any perceived threat. There's no reasonable likelihood for harm or anything like that. It's just any perceived threat would trigger that authority to share. And then when you think about what that means, it's sort of like if you have, for example, someone like myself who's got a great password protecting my online bank account, but I mistype it a lot, and sometimes I get locked out of my bank account as a result. That could conceivably be flagged as a potential threat, trigger the sharing authorization, and then my personally identifiable information associated with that login attempt would be authorized for sharing as it would be directly related to that perceived threat. That's the kind of thing we're trying to avoid. I don't think that companies are going to have the goal of sharing that kind of information, but the problem is they're still authorized to, and they get liability protection for that sharing. And if that happens, and it may happen because lots of people are authorized to share, it's not just highly sophisticated actors, it's anyone. When that happens, the government then receives that information and also has a low standard for removing improperly shared PII. In fact, it's not even clear that the standard is applicable because currently the way the bill is written requires automatic dissemination or requires real-time dissemination to appropriate federal entities, which include the FBI, which include the Department of Defense and thus the NSA and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And so there are real concerns there because there's no even requirement to have that sort of necessary delay to apply privacy procedures that would allow the removal of that improperly shared information. This is something that the privacy community has been fighting for a long time. It's something that's been included in previous versions of legislation, not only the administration's most recent proposal, but also, in fact, an information sharing bill from 2012, the Cybersecurity Act of 2012, which was co-authored by Senator Feinstein and by then chairman of the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, Senator Lieberman. So it's not clear why we can't put that privacy protection back in, since it's already won broad support.
Josh, maybe you can talk about how far the legislation that you're working on can go and what might be some limitations there.
How far in what sense?
In terms of in addressing these concerns about personal information being disseminated.
Absolutely. So I think that we have very much all along been focused on privacy concerns. Robin and I have talked many, many times, as I have with other people in the privacy community, and it's been very helpful. And there have been changes in the bill that have resulted. And I think Daniel and Robin bring up a number of fair points. And I think that if you do string together a number of presumptions, things could end up in a bad place. But there is this question of, are we getting to a point where we're potentially throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? Some people are not going to be as responsible as others, but that doesn't necessarily make the whole enterprise illegitimate. So I think that if you look, for instance, at the amendments that were part of the unanimous consent agreement that the Senate passed at the end of the summer, a number of those were privacy focused. And I think it's fair to say that a number of senators are interested in privacy issues, have proposed amendments to those. Senator Burr and Senator Feinstein are very well aware of that. They have been working on a manager's package previously. One was circulated at the end of the summer that included a number of the privacy improvements that people were looking for. So from Senator Feinstein's perspective, she's always said that these are important issues. People should be interested in them. The Senate should have a right and responsibility to debate them. The ones that can pass should pass. If there's that majority of the Senate who believes that the juice is worth the squeeze, if I can mix my metaphors here, and then at the end of the day, if enough people in the Senate support this bill, then it should pass the Senate. So that the Senate is the great body of compromise, right? And I think it's fair to say that if any particular senator was writing the bill, they would write it in a different way. But after a number of years of working on this issue, and not all things are the same in 2015 as they were in 2014, as they were in 2012, but it's always trying to find where that center of the Senate is. And that's what we've been working for, because there is, in general, a sentiment in the Congress. Obviously, the House not only passed one bill on information sharing, they passed two, that the Senate would be eager to take up and do the same.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of really great amendments out there. I would encourage people in this audience to go out and check some of them out. If you're curious about what they entail and what OTI's position on them, we've got a big list of them. And so you can just go to our website, newamerica.org/OTI, and just search for cybersecurity. But, you know, one thing I would just say is when we think about the procedures in the Senate and things like that, I think one thing that hasn't totally been acknowledged in this legislation is that, you know, and I almost don't like using this phrasing, but it's true. And especially in light of our first keynote speaker, I think it's apropos of this conference. We're living in a post-Snowden world. We know a lot more about what happens when the lines are fuzzy, when it's not clear what the rules are. And for that reason, things are different now than they were in 2012. The privacy community is much more vigorously advocating for clear lines about what the privacy protections are, because we understand that relevant can be interpreted to mean everyone. We don't want to find ourselves in the same position that we did on June 5th, 2013, when the privacy community's worst fears, the things that we had been saying could be the worst case scenario during every Patriot Act reauthorization came true. We don't want the same to be true for the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act or the Protecting Cyber Networks Act. We want to be clear on what companies can do, what the government can do, and what they can't do, so that Americans understand their rights, so that companies understand their responsibilities, and so the government understands what boundaries it has to respect. Right now, none of the bills are perfect. Probably the best bill is the NCPAA, the House Homeland Security Committee's bill, but frankly, even it does not have the highest of standards that are really required for this post-Snowden world. And so to the extent that we're going down the road of information sharing, we do need to look seriously at those amendments, but we also need to recognize that any of those areas where the authorities or the protections and requirements are vague, they're not necessarily going to fall in Americans' favor. Not all entities are going to act in bad faith. Some entities are going to hold themselves to the highest standard, but not all of them will. And we want to make sure that we don't leave room for a race to the bottom, that there's always sort of a clear baseline that is acceptable to everybody.
Robin, let me just step back for a minute and then kind of get to one of your points. But I mean, I think we should all remember, what we're seeing in terms of the threat is that it's expanding, it's broadening, it's becoming more diverse, and that is because more things are being hooked up to the internet every day. The frequency of attacks are increasing in pace. The complexity of attacks and the sophistication of the actors, as well as the type of attack, as we've seen with the North Korean attack on Sony Pictures. We've seen with Saudi Aramco and at the Sands Casino, there are destructive attacks that are becoming more commonplace, and I think that is a trend that will continue. So there is a real need for enhanced cybersecurity. One of the things that underlies that is better information sharing. So I think we, I think most people agree it is an important factor in enhancing the nation's cybersecurity, but it's by no means a silver bullet. But it's important, I think, that when we're looking at these bills to stick to some core principles, and that's why the administration's proposal, which we released in January, set up the NKIC at DHS as this civilian portal. And one of the reasons that we did that is because of the more mature and sophisticated privacy regime that is in place at the NKIC, the better oversight and better transparency. And I think that is critical. And what's critical is that in any of these bills, a large portion, and I think this gets to your point about uncertainty and getting surprised later, is that it depends who writes the rules, and it depends on how they write the rules that will govern this type of sharing, and that's a critical component. And Senators Burr and Feinstein have made some important changes along those lines, and have recognized the importance of having DHS as that civilian center. But obviously there are further changes that could be made to strengthen that. But I think you raise a good point, and one of the ways to ensure that we have a better understanding of what actually these laws will allow is to build in transparency, better oversight, and more clarity about who is writing these rules and how they're doing it.
I wanted to echo what Jeffrey was saying about the fact that the network is increasingly hostile. I mean, I think I absolutely do agree with that. As more devices come online, there are lots of different ways that information can be leaked. There's lots of additional threats that we may or may not know how to defend against. So I agree that we need to do additional work to improve the information security of systems for America, for the entire world. However, I don't think that this information sharing approach is the place that we need to be investing our energy, right? I mean, so one of the simple things people can do to be more secure on the network is update your software. Well, who has the largest deployment of Windows XP machines? I mean, we have specific things that we can do, that we can spend government energy and resources to make sure that there are better information security practices throughout a country and beyond. And the idea that suddenly turning around and sharing more information to detect these threats, when we know that there are concrete things that we can do that we have not done, seems like a mistake to me. We know that keeping your software up to date is important. We know that strong cryptography is important for information security. Who are some of the people who've actually caused trouble for strong cryptography, right? The FBI is pushing to weaken crypto. The NSA has seeded bad cryptographic algorithms into international standards. These are things that move against the cybersecurity goal, right? If your goal is information security, let's not say, well, let's just spread the information that we think might actually be vulnerable around to more parties and increase the attack surface. Let's go ahead and do the baseline things that we know how to do already that we're not doing. We do have information sharing right now. There is information sharing, and it works. It's useful. I mean, as a software developer, I receive reports about vulnerabilities in software that I'm either responsible for or I might be helping to distribute to other people. And I act on those reports, and I update that software and make sure that it gets out to other users. So these are things that we can spend time doing. We can help people to know for sure that the software they got is the software they intended to get, right? We can log the different versions of, say, the firmware that you're going to run in the network switches, so that you know that when you upload new firmware to the network switch, you're actually running the right firmware and not some firmware that's been Trojaned by, pick the government that you fear the most, or the corporation that you fear the most, or your corporate espionage adversary. We can provide binary transparency. We can provide reproducible builds so that you know that the software you get matches the source code that it came from. There's a whole slew of things that we could be investing in, and we could make sure that the government follows best practices to update all of the operating systems that they run. Why do we need, what is it about this bill? What is the additional information sharing that this bill offers? Because we currently do information sharing. That's the baby that we would be throwing out, right? And you say we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I want to know, what's this additional baby? We've got ways to share information right now.
Well, just before Josh responds, I mean, I agree. There are things that we are doing. I mean, clearly you've identified problems that we all recognize, and to say that those are not happening, and that we're just focusing on information sharing to the detriment of anything else, I don't think is accurate. I mean, obviously the breach at OPM was a huge kind of moment, at least for federal cybersecurity, in a way that highlighted a lot of the things that we need to do, a lot of the legacy systems that we have in place that don't allow us to do some of those things, and the need for more investment. So, I mean, from the government's perspective, I mean, we're very focused on that, and that is something that we are doing every day. And particularly the cybersecurity framework was a direct response to congressional inaction in that particular field, and has been helpful, and we are trying to push that out further and encourage other entities to take those best practices as well. But I'm sure Josh would like to respond.
Before Josh, I just wanted to jump in on. Sure. I mean, he seems to want to take his time, so I'll jump in on just one thing about the sort of, why are we doing more, or why do we need more information sharing? I mean, obviously the class of companies that I represent are generally internet companies and software developers, and they are generally comfortable doing information sharing as it is. But I do run in the same circles as people who represent sort of more legacy companies or older companies that are more risk averse, and you'll see this in particular, I guess, I think with the retail industry. They just implemented a retail ISAC in March of this year. They have historically been less comfortable with information sharing because they are more hyper aware, I think, of the way that legal frameworks constrain them. And so I don't necessarily agree with their perspective on the way that they feel constrained, perhaps, but that is some of the class of companies, I think, that see the need for more information sharing.
There's irony in that, though, because the retail industry is one of the best examples of an industry that is very slow to adopt the newer security techniques. I don't think that we should be rewarding those industries with a get-out-of-jail-free card of like, here, liability-free information sharing. We should be finding ways to make it very clear that they need to be responsible for not waiting, for example, for the Department of Commerce to force them to update to chip and pin, but rather find ways to secure their networks, to secure their transactions, and to make sure that they are being affirmatively responsible and proactive about their cybersecurity and their customer cybersecurity. I don't think information sharing legislation gets us there, and I worry that we've got an industry that is already reticent to make those changes, to make those investments. And by passing information sharing, we allow them to sit back on their heels even more, rather than to sort of lean in and try to really find the best solutions for their networks and for their customers.
So apparently I want to respond. I'll go ahead and do that now. So a couple points. People have brought up very important issues here. I think that it is important to remember that information sharing is not everything. And I know the Senate Intelligence Committee, through our oversight role, and Senator Feinstein through her broader work in Congress, is very focused on what the government can do to improve cybersecurity, both within its own networks and to help companies and individuals to improve their cybersecurity throughout. And the government spends billions and billions of dollars a year to improve its own cybersecurity and to help everyone else. Everything from the National Science Foundation offering grants to cutting edge technologies that come over through technology transfer to just conversations. Government people show up at information security conferences all the time, and I think that in general, people feel as though they contribute and they do so in an open way, and that's something that we want to encourage. So as far as information sharing goes, just because it doesn't solve everything, and just because it doesn't come out with any risks of potential bad behavior and the like, doesn't make it, from our committee's perspective, a worthless endeavor. It's an important thing. Again, it is certainly not the only thing. And that's a reason why it's something that we're focused on, because beyond repealing sequestration, which is something that Senator Feinstein believes should happen, and providing more money to entities like OPM and DHS and across the federal government that have important contributions to make for cybersecurity, this is an area where what Congress does matters, and we would certainly expect and hope that the information security community would not wait for Congress to act and would do things on their own. And finally, just to touch on some of these other very important points that people have brought up about data security standards and other things, I think it's important to remember that if there's one thing that I'm sure the internet community and corporate America would violently agree on, is it's how much they would love Congress to step in and to regulate things. Right? I think everyone would get really excited about that. So how we address those problems is incredibly difficult, and finding the right way to do it is important, and it's a conversation that has been ongoing and certainly should continue. But that is a different conversation than information sharing. It is a cybersecurity conversation, but it is not the same thing. Patching systems is not the same thing as sharing what malicious IP addresses are. And we have to do all of it, but we have to there's only so much that you can bite off and chew at the same time. I know it's shocking for you guys to hear a congressional staffer say that, but it's important for everyone, right? We can't solve all these problems at once. We have to address the ones that we can in hopefully the most responsible way that we can.
Thanks. I think we're running up against the end of our time here, so I wanted to see if there are any questions from the audience.
Josh, I'm less concerned about the immunity of the bill than the federal regulatory authority exemption in the bill. So under Section 5, say I'm GM, right, and a security researcher comes to me and says, you've got a gaping hole in your Wi-Fi updates. I then take that information, I consider that a DMCA breach, because I think that my software is copyrighted. So therefore that's an attack. The security researcher's information about my gaping holes is an attack. I give it to DHS. Under this bill, once I've given that information to DHS, the federal government cannot use that information to initiate regulatory action. So NHTSA cannot require a recall, the FTC cannot sue. How much, and I've asked a ton of lawyers about this, and none of them can answer whether that in fact would be the case. If I'm a corporation, why don't I do that? Why don't I preemptively share to make sure that the government can't do anything to punish me for being sloppy?
So this is a good question. I'm trying to keep the actors straight in your hypothetical, but I will point you to a different part of the bill, the actual first rule of construction in Section 8, before I get to some of the limitations in that quote-unquote bar on regulation. In Section 8, it talks about that nothing in this bill, and I will quote, will limit or prohibit otherwise lawful use of disclosures by any federal entity, even when such lawful disclosures duplicate or replicate disclosures made under this act. So, for instance, in your hypothetical, if a auto manufacturer tries to kind of beat somebody to the post and says, hey, I have this vulnerability, you can't regulate me on that. That doesn't mean that the government can't use other information that it requires, even if it's duplicative, to exercise its lawful authority. So it is a complicated question, and what we tried to do in the bill is, for instance, if you are a regulated entity, say the power sector, and you know, for instance, that if there are certain vulnerabilities, you would be subject to a fine from your regulator. Would we want a situation where a power company does not report that vulnerability, chooses to remain ignorant of that vulnerability so as to avoid a fine? Or would we rather that they responsibly disclose and we can take steps to further cybersecurity?
But
So
the equivalent under the under Bank Secrecy Act, that is already happening. The banks are self-disclosing information, and we can't put the bankers in jail for having done that. So why shouldn't we be concerned that the same risk is actually bigger in this case?
So I'm not going to comment on the Bank Secrecy Act, but I will say that we, as I mentioned, the language that I just read aloud, and also I promised some words about the limitations on the regulatory provision. So it talks about direct use, and it talks about lawful activities. So for instance, if a company is doing something that is unlawful and the government becomes aware about it, this bill doesn't prevent the government from doing something.
I mean, part of the problem that we're talking about here is we are disincenting corporations from fixing their bad code. That's not illegal right now. It's legal for GM to have crappy code. The way the government makes sure that GM doesn't have crappy code is to issue recalls or to make sure that they're doing what they promised the consumers to do.
So I certainly don't want to steal our short question time, but I will say it's also not illegal for Mozilla to have crappy code. It's not illegal for Windows to have crappy code. And in my comments earlier, it is a delicate thing, and if the government is going to start making the decision as far as what is quote unquote crappy code or not, that is something that deserves a lot of scrutiny. And there is a balance there. So it's certainly a legitimate concern, but I feel as though it's part of a much larger conversation. We'll leave it there.
I wanted to take one more question. Yes.
Yeah, a certain presidential candidate that should go unnamed had a 55,000-page release of email data, and it's become very controversial. I'm wondering about, there's a lot of issues there, and since an august panel probably has thoughts about it. One thing is the level of security. I mean, a lot of things are classified that are in the newspapers, just aren't really, doesn't really rise to the level of being classified, but there's that ambiguity in the government. And can anybody survive scrutiny of 55,000 pages? Books are published every day, in 10, 15, 5 years, a year later, you find typos all over the place in 200 or 300 or 400 page books. Can anybody produce perfection at that level of microscopic analysis? And there's probably a million other issues. But any thoughts you have from that situation, what could have been done better, should have been done better, other than sort of the obvious stuff that's come out in the press? But any particular insights you have that kind of scenario?
So, I mean, I'm not going to speak to what could have or should have been done better. I guess I won't directly answer your question, but I think that when we think, yeah, I mean, I think, to answer your question more broadly, I think that when we think about this from a public policy perspective, what we need to be thinking about is a few things. As Josh said, it's concerning to think that we might be regulating how code is written and things like that. I'm not really sure that's the path to go down. I don't think that we've seen that play out very well in the past. But what Congress is well positioned to be doing is finding ways to incentivize businesses, individuals, schools, et cetera, to do a better job with network security and to create a framework that's able to evolve perhaps through a multi-stakeholder process similar to the one that built the NIST cybersecurity information sharing framework. And also to actually address the cybersecurity issues that are preventing us from doing a good job of protecting our networks. And those are two things. One of them I don't think is very controversial. Let's update the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act so that security researchers can do their job free from the fear of improper prosecution. And the other thing, and this is the more controversial thing, is, at the end of the day, we've seen some movement toward this with the FTC case against Wyndham, but I think that companies need to hold themselves responsible and need to be held generally responsible and liable if they do a bad job, if they do a subpar job of protecting user data. This is going to require not only the will to hold companies responsible, and so it's on individuals to exercise their rights for data protection, but it's also going to require transparency. We've got to start having a better understanding of how our data is being stored and what data is being stored and whether that's necessary, because, as Dan pointed out, we're keeping too much of it. We're having an attack surface that's much larger than need be. And as consumers whose data is vulnerable to those breaches, we should be actively advocating to make sure that companies are endeavoring to protect us as much as possible.
I think with that, our time is all up. So thank you so much to the panelists, to CFP.
There was no real way to answer it. It's like, I don't know anything about her system, so.
Take that forward. Thank you.
Look. I want to play the company perspective about killing my company. So it's like, oh, the reasons guys. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Which they
Far cry. Question on the topic of liability. It's the same committee, right?
So, the Senate Intelligence Committee did put out the report on the rendition and detention and interrogation study. The study on rendition and detention and interrogation. I will say that I can't comment on resolution. It's a question for the Department of Justice, not a question for me. Just outside when we talk about we don't prosecute anybody.
So,
Question?
Oh yeah, back in 2012, in Pleasant Office, formerly prior to this known network. Good time.
So I worked with rendition.
So and Neil Quinter, I guess Jonathan Best is not gone on the banking side.
I like it. It's me. Hey, Simpson. Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Yeah, well, I was happy to come around.
Yeah, thanks very much. You don't have to.
So why, I mean, because the other part of it, the insurance, right? So we know that the DOT are the DOT have the same level of.
So, I mean, insecurity, right, is one, like, they also have firewalls there.
When you're trying to do these measures, if you have strong applications,
But not
so why are we giving it more data? I don't
every user system is the same. And it's, yeah, well, I'll just say that if your kid has information about a health thing that we because there are certain systems in their network. So that's, right, it's a question. Right.
Yeah, they know about it, but they can't have part of the question is why we want to give options and that's right.
So, but if I'm just whether it's beef or chat, they shouldn't get higher because there's something. So, I mean, I literally doesn't do a better job. I get exposed to give $100 billion to all the baby. Absolutely secure. My speculation is they find out their value. You guys are so I really want to be appropriate processes in place. Yeah. Including health management can't take it. They were right. So again, right. That's not that. So like if you're honest, like so that's like they shouldn't. If then there's like you can say that. So whatever information they receive from anyone, you could say, why should an actor do this? Because there's some religious matter that
But your experience doesn't have that. That's what I'm saying.
So I will just say, yes, I think it's an interesting question.
Center, do you want to be?
But if you think maybe that makes more sense.
Playing the.
It's also a huge department in areas of different information systems that has
Right, so data sharing all happening. So, given that that's happening, why unionize the data sharing priorities rather than one?
So community is different. So, like, under your question on why should a DOE be able to get information until the security systems should they cut themselves off from all information sharing? This liability.
The question is, why is it focused to prioritize something that's already happening?
So Congress is Congress is also
Who's going to be our speaker?
What's that?
Who's going to be our speaker?
Our speaker?
Yeah, actually, if you got any.
That's a very good question. Ask Paul Ryan, and once he gives you an answer, then I'll answer that question. The answer is
I only asked one question.
nobody's going to answer that question until he does.
Yeah.
We're actually
I know,
trying to
I
organize a
answered,
debate
so
among the
now I
various
know.
candidates. Oh wow, that'd be cool.
I asked the same question
But
I
once
asked
again,
you.
they don't want to do it until they know what the hell Paul Ryan's doing.
Josh had no answer.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody has an answer.
So
Without
it's a mess and nobody knows what's going on.
Jeff, how are we on sound?
Even if it's not.
Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me? This is mine. This is yours. All right, so welcome. Thanks everybody for joining us. I'm going to keep introductions as short as possible because we have 7 people up here, 6 panelists, all of whom are more interesting than I am. And I'm just going to have everybody do quick intros, just name and title and the organization. Very briefly, myself, I'm Sean Vitka. I'm Legislative Counsel with Credo. And we'll start with Daniel.
Sure. I'm Daniel Schumann. I'm Policy Director with Demand Progress.
I'm Nima Gliani. I'm the Legislative Counsel with the American Civil Liberties Union.
I'm Marcy Wheeler. I write as Empty Wheel.
I'm Josh Withrow, Legislative Affairs Manager at FreedomWorks.
I'm Pat Eddington, Policy Analyst in Civil Liberties, Homeland Security at the Cato Institute.
My name is Jolanda Rondon. I'm a staff attorney with the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee.
Thank you. So briefly, the overall view here, my 40,000-foot view in terms of the goal, is to expose everybody who's watching this to the conversations that happen behind the scenes from within the reform sphere. So everybody here would probably identify as a reformer, thinks that there needs to be changes to the surveillance regime that we live with. I've invited everybody to chime in when other people speak, shy of interrupting each other. And I'm just going to jump right into the questions, and hopefully we'll have time for Q&A on the other side. Most of these questions will not be for everybody to answer, but I'm hoping everybody will have an opportunity to chime in as it becomes relevant to whatever they might want to say. So first, let's start with Yolanda. I kind of want everybody just to say quickly, but in as concrete terms as possible, and it's very difficult to do this, so give everybody slack. What does successful reform look like to you? And to maybe put it in more of or an easier question, what do you want America to look like in terms of surveillance in 5 years?
Well, we want it to be perfect, I guess, but as an attorney and speaking in, that's my background and experience, we want to make sure that the fundamental fair trial rights are upheld, even in the FISA courts. So we have to make sure that there's actual substantive redressability, not only through the FISA courts, but through the circuit courts, when surveillance is conducted on persons without probable cause, without suspicion. We want to also make sure that there's a right and a right to have an attorney there to dispute any surveillance warrant that is issued. And so that goes into the notice and issue requirements. Lastly, tied to this is that there needs to be substantive limitations on the use of the national security exception. The government can't keep coming back year after year for the same person saying national security exception. If it's been 5 years and you still have not addressed or taken that suspect down, then how truly is it a national security exception? So the limits need to be maybe perhaps after 2 years, you need to provide the court with some evidence to verify and justify your continued surveillance of that particular individual. Lastly, of course, working for Arab Americans and representing mainly Muslim Americans in this country, we have to make sure that there are actually sufficient protocols in place to prevent information sharing and data collection with countries who do not uphold our human rights, I'm going to say that our human rights principles with sharing and using that in a wrongful manner to either intimidate their families back home in Arab nations, or using it as a mechanism to say, hey, if you don't do this, we're going to pursue criminal charges. We're going to mess up your immigration papers. So I think we need to make sure there are actual substantive human rights and protections there, and giving actual more power to the current amici curiae before the FISA courts. Their primary responsibility is not to protect civil rights and liberties. It's to provide advice that who knows they really can consider.
So you described the need for an adversarial process to some extent for surveillance. Is there any conceptualization of the FISA court that would satisfy you?
Probably not. But I think that I feel that the FISA court doesn't have sufficient power to have an objective reasoning of evidence brought before them. They are approving at least 95% of warrants and surveillance requests put forth by the government. So I think that there needs to be, they're appointed, and it isn't necessary for appointment, but there needs to be some type of rollover with the judges when there are concerns that come about that they're not adequately considering all the evidence brought before them.
Thank you. Pat?
So we live in an age in which we have laws on the books with respect to surveillance that should never have existed in the first place. What do I mean by that? The entire rationale for pushing through the Patriot Act and then subsequently the FISA Amendments Act after that was that, and this is what folks like Bob Litt and Michael Hayden and just the whole litany of them have basically snowed the American people on this idea that they just didn't have enough information to stop the bad guys. So we have two national inquiries into this that refuted that. The first was the Congressional Joint Inquiry in 2002, and the second one, of course, was the 9/11 Commission. So the entire premise of these laws, the Patriot Act, the FISA Amendments Act, so on and so forth, is built on a lie. And I use that word advisedly because that's really what it is. They never needed these authorities. They don't need them today. So to answer Sean's question directly, in my ideal world, 5 years from now, these laws are literally historical artifacts. In my ideal world, 5 years from now, we have had a second church committee that has examined the full scope of all of these activities. And in my ideal world, 5 years from now, we have every single American who's connected online using encryption and other secure methods to secure their communications against malicious hackers as well as against the U.S. government.
So, I guess in my ideal world, it looks a lot like Pat's. And our primary objection to the way that surveillance is handled in the U.S. today is effectively a principled and constitutional one. Is that there is a process. There are certain requirements for due process that are required under our system of law, and we'd like to see that those are followed. So even ideally in 5 years, you'd like to see a system where Americans can feel assured that unless they are subject of an actual specific investigation, legal, criminal, that there will be specific warrants issued before their information is allowed to be collected, retained, and used by agencies of the United States government for the purposes of tracking, prosecuting them. And then to that point, there needs to be more transparency, and that means that when there are discussions being had about what the authorities of the government are in terms of how broad their surveillance is, how much of the data is being retained, and for what purposes they can be used, some of that decision needs to be held in forums where the American people have an idea of what is going on in the first place. And that means, at the very least, reform of the processes around the FISA court, and how broadly those could be, well, that's a bigger discussion.
Marcy?
Get rid of the FISA court. There's no reason for the FISA. I mean, every single courthouse in this country now has a SCIF and now has security officers. So the reasons why the FISA court was instituted in the first place no longer exist on that level, and it now serves just as an invitation to authorize these programmatic collection programs that shouldn't be necessary. I mean, the FBI collects plenty of data going to magistrates all around the country and hoards it. There's no reason why NSA couldn't do the same. But I would also say that the government's hoarding too much data. I mean, the government should be able to get the information it needs to keep us safe, but it should not be able to hoard it. And that's happening all over the government. And that, again, I think is an invitation for abuse.
So my dream world, I think, does look a lot like Pat's, but I'd probably add a couple more requirements. I think the first is that right now we sort of live in a legal system that doesn't reflect the advances in technology. So what do I mean by that? We have an infrastructure for collection of information in the US that is entirely different from the infrastructure we have for collection of information outside the US. But the reality is that when I send an email, it probably gets routed outside the US. Or when I use certain types of data services, that data may be stored outside the US. And so I think we need to really address this fundamental disconnect between our laws and the way technology is actually working right now. The second thing I think that we need to address is really increasing the ability of courts to address and judge on these questions. I mean, the ACLU brought litigation about surveillance years ago, and they were often thrown out because either state secrets or they didn't have standing. And that's really a failure of the judicial system. We shouldn't have to wait for an Edward Snowden or, kind of these dramatic disclosures to really prompt some examination of programs that raise legitimate privacy and civil liberties concerns. And then the third is, and Marcy sort of touched on this, is, we have the Fourth Amendment and we have in place a warrant requirement. And I think that what hasn't been fully fleshed out, or what justification doesn't exist, is why that warrant process can also apply to the national security context. We've sort of put national security on a pedestal that says, okay, well, we need a special set of rules, and those rules need to be a lot weaker for national security. And I think that it's time to really test that theory and really go back to having a warrant process that existed for so long and was sufficient for keeping our country safe.
Thank you.
So, I mean, I would say just conceptually, it's simple for me, which is a restoration of the balance of power between the branches. There are issues that will continue to come up, whether it's different provisions of current law, whether authorities that the executive branch discovers under 12333 or elsewhere. But our ability to find out what's going on and to push back on them is ultimately what will provide us the ability to address these problems. So when you look at separation of powers, I mean, in the panelists have touched on this. So on the court side, right, the FISC doesn't make any sense anymore. Certainly beyond its original created purpose, it's going way beyond the warrant requirement. So in the context of the FISC, in the context of the ability people bring suits, in the context of the Congress, it's a restructuring of Congress so that it's actually able to engage in oversight of what the executive branch is doing to find out what's going on, to actually be effective in regulating these kinds of activities. In the context of the executive branch, it's things along the lines of you can't have secret legal opinions by the Office of Legal Counsel that obviates the actions of Congress and a number of other activities as well. You can't go and assert inherent powers within the executive branch to engage in behaviors without having any type of recourse on it. So, I mean, for me, a lot of this collapses down to making sure that you have checks and balances within the legislative, executive, and judicial branch that works as a way of helping to address and expose the problems that we continue to see popping up again and again.
Thank you. And so, for context, the reason I wanted to start there is because from within this sphere, from within this reform sphere, these are all different perspectives, right? Some of these line up more than others. I'm sure that it wouldn't take us long to find somebody who did not want to get rid of the FISA court, for instance, or thought that that was a hard thing to do or too hard to pursue. That informs how all of our groups and how we as individuals end up interacting and trying to change the system. And so the rest of these questions don't necessarily have a right answer. I think they're hard questions, or I'd like to think they're hard questions, and they're up for discussion. So I'm just going to invite people to chime in as they see fit. We have some idea about how to change policy, and it usually looks like some kind of math of send phone calls, emails, letters to Congress, send lobbyists to Congress, make a bunch of public statements, make enemies out of certain people, make heroes out of others. There's some kind of that plus X plus Y equals reform. But if we are not looking at the same kind of reform, then we end up with in different places. And so to the group, and I guess I might open up actually, I might ask Nima and Josh to speak first. Do we need unison when we have a reform item, or do we need a flank? And so I'll either of you.
I think certainly I think what was demonstrated in this last multi-year battle that happened over the reauthorization of Section 215 is, from my perspective, I think it was very useful and perhaps even essential to achieving whatever you consider the USA Freedom Act to have been. My organization did not end up supporting the bill, but in order to receive any sort of reform at all, and at least to not achieve a worsening of the current status quo, I think it was very helpful to have a flank out there, and that was the position that we took. And I think that if you don't have some groups out there kind of planting the flag for what a perhaps even unrealistically ideal level of reform would look like, it becomes too easy for folks on the other side of the issue, the intelligence community and others, to kind of dominate the debate and pull it more in their direction. You've got to have, finding the center of any debate is a matter of a tug of war, and there has to be people at the far ends of either side of the rope doing the tugging.
Yeah, so I think it's really context specific, and it depends on the dynamics in Congress. But I think that what's important is, whether the groups are working in unison or whether there's a flank, that they actually be working in concert. It's like, what do I mean by that? So, for example, if there's a large segment of groups who want to say a bill doesn't go far enough, and they want that bill to be taken down, to fail, etc., there's got to be a plan for that inside the Beltway legislatively for how you follow up on that. So if we have a bill that's incremental progress and there's a flank that, influential flank that causes that bill not to move or to fail in some respects, I think we all need to be working together to figure out, well, what is the next bill that takes its place? What is the action? Are there other members of Congress that will actually support that position? I think otherwise we end up in a situation where we give members of Congress the ability to have their cake and eat it too, right? They can stand on a podium and they can say, I'm with you. I'm with you when I say I want real reform, but I actually don't have to invest the time, the political capital, the funds, whatever, into getting a solution that will satisfy you. And so I think that is one area where we, I think, can do better in exacting a price or pushing members to not just have the right position vocally, but to actually take the steps that would lead to the reform that I think we all want in some respects.
So on that particular theme, I'll tell a really quick war story, and I promise I will be quick. So I spent over 10 years working for what National Journal once described as one of the House's 10 most liberal members, a guy by the name of Rush Holt from New Jersey. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because, yes, he is the guy who beat IBM's Watson computer at Jeopardy. So a super smart guy. Also, though, what made him unique, one of the many things that made him unique, is that he was actually a former intelligence officer himself. He was an analyst in the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research back during the 1980s. So, you know, when he actually served on the House Intelligence Committee, it was much more difficult for them to try to buffalo him on pretty much anything because he understood the system, he understood how our collection systems work and all the rest of that kind of thing, right? So one of the things that gave us the ability, at least when the Democrats had gavels, to kind of move things forward is the very phenomenon that Josh and Sean have been talking about. In that, within the Democratic caucus, Rush basically was the leader of about 40 or 50 members who were extremely hardcore on wanting to try to, if not dismantle the surveillance state, roll it back in a very, very huge way. And so once you actually had the Risen revelations about Stellar Wind in 2005, and Congress went through all these hijinks in that period thereafter to come up with this monstrosity called the Protect America Act, once Democrats actually took back the House, there was this moment, there was this window of opportunity to try to really do something special. And when the Intelligence Committee in the House at that time, chaired by Celeste Reyes, came up with their proposed reform bill, it would not have gone nearly far enough. And so essentially we engaged in a whip operation from our office in opposition to the bill. And as a result, they had to deal with us because they had no chance of moving. I mean, they were going to get nothing but a stonewall from Republicans anyway at that point. So we actually had the opportunity to get a whole series of additional amendments onto this bill, which was known as the Restore Act. And we wound up with a vastly better piece of legislation, precisely because we had the ability to kind of force the issue, because we controlled enough votes literally to bring down the bill. And by having that power, we had the ability to improve it. Now, why do I tell that story? I tell that story because right now in the United States House of Representatives, a very similar, although much more high stakes kind of game along those lines is taking place, and that's for the Speaker of the House. And the reason that this matters is that the folks in the House Freedom Caucus, and whether you agree with where they stand on a given issue or not, one of the things that they're fighting for is to try to ensure that there is a far more open process for the consideration of legislation in the House. Why do I bring that up? We did not have an open consideration of the USA Freedom Act in the United States House of Representatives. And that's why we didn't get, in my view, as good a bill. That's why the community did not get as good a bill as we could have had. And it's not like we can't get success on major reform provisions through the House when there's an open process. One of the guys most responsible for taking down John Boehner, Tom Massey of Kentucky, I guess I should say Thomas, he doesn't like Tom, Thomas Massey of Kentucky, has been successful 2 years in a row in getting extremely strong language on appropriations bills that would rein in some of the very things that we're talking about up here, right? So if we actually have a better outcome with respect to people who take a flank position, who are able to actually then use their power to move things in the right direction, you really have the chance to transform it. And I'll just finish with this. 2 of the candidates who are either running for Speaker right now or thinking about it, Jason Chaffetz of Utah and Darrell Issa of California, according to a tool developed by some of our friends in the privacy and civil liberties community, a congressional scorecard, if you will, those 2 gentlemen would be vast improvements in terms of a commitment to surveillance reform than anybody else being considered right now, including the current chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Ryan.
Pat, to bring this to how Nima described the situation, is your suggestion that the flank is not robust enough right now? Or to invert that, is it possible that the more moderate portion or faction is too strong in the sense that they are able to validate a less extreme or less ambitious reform?
Yeah, I mean, you could slice it either way. I think it comes down ultimately to, for me at least, a much larger question, which is, why did we only have 88 members in the House of Representatives who wanted to go for a stronger piece of legislation rather than the USA Freedom Act, right? I think if you, just for the moment, just for the sake of argument, if you set aside the procedural hijinks that were used in order to force USA Freedom Act through the House with no amendments, you set that aside for a moment. Those 88 members essentially kind of represent the vanguard, if you will, kind of the cutting edge of it. So the real question then becomes, at least in my mind, If what you want is real reform, there are two pathways, and that's to try to convince the other folks who thought USA Freedom Act was good enough, or the best that could be had given the circumstances, convince them to move in the right direction. Or, and this gets outside of what folks in the 501c3 and 501c4 arena can do, you look at scenarios whereby you change the composition of the House of Representatives in the United States Senate, right? I mean, that at the end of the day, and that's why we're going to hear a lot of discussion today that I personally am not going to engage in about details of legislation. I will tell you, I don't think that the details of legislation make any difference right now as long as you have a House and Senate that are not clearly pro-liberty. And I mean by a clear-cut majority being genuinely pro-liberty. And when I say pro-liberty, you can substitute pro-Bill of Rights. That's my concern.
Just 2 points. One is, Dan pointed out at the beginning that we're talking about a balance of power between parts of government, and we've forgotten courts thus far in this discussion. And so I think as we talk about what we as activists do, and I mean the ACLU is the best at this, right, is challenging these things in the courts as well, but we need to be cognizant that our actions may have effects both in courts and in Congress, and ultimately in the presidency. As I've thought about this panel, we had a very similar panel in 2009 to talk about the Vice Amendments Act. And both then and now, we have presidential candidates where you can use them as a talking point. I mean, for Chris Dodd is horrible at MPAA, but while he was running for president in 2008, at least took a stance against immunity for telecoms, and that was a really important tool. The other thing that I would say about flanks, it is true that you need to be willing to compromise in Congress to get things done, but it's also important to be aware of what those compromises have entailed. So just for example, USA Freedom Act didn't really address the collection of non-communications data. It didn't address the collection of financial data. And in fact, arguably, this may be a bad faith interpretation on the part of the government, but arguably it doesn't even stop bulk collection of financial data. And that is probably why Chuck Schumer was a supporter of the bill. And that is not readily apparent in these discussions, that we traded off letting financial companies continue to operate in secret and cooperate with the government for this bill needs to be out there on the table, because if it's not, then it's not clear where the moderates really are and what the trade-offs have been to get a bill.
Just to add to that, I would just say it's a good point she makes, because I think we have attempted and are working on changing that narrative. The narrative is always safety, security, but we've been able to try to spin or shed some light on a new narrative, abuse and waste. And so I think it's important, like she said, to highlight people's personal motivation, because it changes that narrative for Congress and for society as a whole.
I just think. Sorry, go ahead. Just one more thing to add. I think using this latest USA Freedom thing as an example, I think one of the most valuable things that the kind of the flank contributed to it was, regardless of whether or not you thought that the bill was the best that we could get, which that's a reasonable debate to have. I think the importance of having a flank is where, especially on the Republican wing, there really wasn't one before, is that it was very important that people recognize that, regardless of whether the bill was the best you could get, it's not the end of reform, that it was essentially a starting point. Wherein I think a lot of the folks on the other side of the issue would have been very happy to paint this as, we have reformed this, it's done now, move on. Now, obviously, that debate is still very much alive and well, and I think the flank is very much responsible for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think realistically, when we look back at this debate or we look at other debates, the question is always, at what point do you take an incremental change forward, right? And so my old boss, Laura Murphy, always tells this story about, the crack and cocaine sentencing disparity, and how, the push was to have it be 1-to-1. Everybody recognized it was unfair. Everybody recognized that it had a disparate impact on minorities, and we were pushing for a 1-to-1. And on the table was a deal that would make it 1-to-8. Now, that was better than the 1-to-17 disparity that existed before, but it was nowhere near what the ACLU wanted, and I think that what a lot of us in this room would have wanted and would have thought was fair. And that was a deal we supported. And the idea was that you had the small step forward and it would yield dividends down the road. Number one, it would, for at least people who are being sentenced, offer them, a small, if not complete respite from really unfair sentencing laws. And the second was this question of, does success, even mild or moderate success in this one area, yield benefits down the road? Does it create an environment where you can bring together people on criminal justice reform later on because they've done it once, they weren't burned, they still got their seat in Congress? And I think we have a similar, phenomenon in surveillance, and I think that played out with the USA Freedom Act. I mean, I think that there were some groups that said, I think this might be the best we can get right now. Again, that's a judgment call. It's hard to read the tea leaves and know whether that was true or not. But also there's a value in showing members of Congress, moderate members of Congress who are not the ones who are generally supportive of surveillance reform, you can vote for this and you're not going to lose your seat in Congress. You're not going to take a hit so that you could have these benefits down the road. And I think we've talked a lot about the House, but what we haven't talked about is a very real reality in the Senate, which is that we don't have the votes for significant surveillance reform right now. We have a weakness where we need to flip members. And so while we're operating in that, I think, very real situation, we have to think about how we kind of move the ball forward, potentially in a way that is not everything we all want, but is certainly a step forward from the status quo.
I want to make sure Daniel has a chance to chime in.
And I think that's a useful point, and there's sort of two things that I would tack on to that. The first is that to give us that opportunity, right, to be able to play in the Senate, whatever legislation that you're working on, you need to create future opportunities to come back and take a whack at it again. And that's things like GAO reports, IG reports. It's looking at creating structures that will give you newshook and other opportunities. We can't wait around, for another Snowden to stand up and sort of sacrifice himself on the altar of national security information. If you don't build into the process future opportunities for legislative action, future opportunities, this panel is about grassroots, but the grassroots to get engaged, that's a real problem. You need to have those future opportunities built in, so whether it's a legislative fight or whether it's a fight over an election, you have an opportunity to have that discussion, to have that debate. And the other point that I would add is that it is often useful to have groups working in concert, whether there's some sort of a middle way and some folks who sort of are looking to the best possible world. There are also certain issues in which compromise is not possible. There are some things that indicate or implicate fundamental rights or certain behaviors that at whatever level are simply unacceptable. And there is utility from an electoral perspective, from an organizing perspective, on those types of issues to not being willing to compromise. Something that is better but still awful is still awful. And you have to make a judgment. And I don't think anyone here would disagree with it, but you have to make a judgment as to whether you would rather have the debate and have a better chance to fix it later on, or whether you'd rather have an incremental change now. But knowing the way that Congress works, you probably won't have another opportunity again for a decade or two.
Just a detail about USA Freedom Act that a lot of people may not know is that the DOJ's Inspector General had finished a 5-year in the process Inspector General report on Section 215, and FBI managed to hold it up so that it was not released to the public until after the legislation. It also held up a Penn Register IG report, and that still has only been released to the public in very, very cursory summary. And FBI is still holding up an IG report on how the FBI actually uses 215, the phone dragnet data, as well as one on how the DEA and FBI have used other phone dragnet data. So it's true that those IG reports, and the IG made it clear before USA Freedom Act passed that he was being held up. And I believe I was the only person who cared, who mentioned it. It just kind of went under the wayside. So that is a way, and I think we're already doing that on the 702 fight, but that is an area where we did poorly. We did get the IG report before actual USA Freedom Act passed in 2015, and it showed that, among other things, FBI took, from 2006, when the USA Freedom Act extension was passed, when Patriot Act extension was passed, with a mandate that there be minimization procedures to protect privacy. FBI took until 2013 after the Snowden revelations to actually fulfill that legal requirement.
And we should point out, and Marcy, correct me if I'm wrong, that no one inside DOJ or FBI has been held accountable for those violations of the law. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah.
I'll just point, I'm going to want to move to the next question. I'll plug Mercy's blog, Empty Wheel, just because for that level of detail, there's really not a lot of places you can go. So you should follow it if you're not. All right, so we talked a lot about compromise, and I want to double back to that. One of the more conspicuous things for people, at least within DC, is that the people who are most engaged on this, at least in the lobbying level, tend to be predominantly white and predominantly male. And that is can't be good, right? It's just you can't look at it and be like, oh, it's four white guys talking, right? And I wanted to open that up for discussion. This is like sincerely, and it's not that impressive, like the most diverse panel that you might see at a conference like this.
It is the most diverse panel, so good job.
And so that's probably bad news. So I want to open that up. I don't know that I should say any more about the topic except for I'm sorry. But in all sincerity, like I think this is something that we do need to address. I do think that it leads to a different perspective on bills. So we're talking about compromise, and I guess the real question is who's doing the compromising? Because a lot of this happens in one-to-one moments, whether or not it's staff to staff within the Hill, lobbyist or an organization to staff, or organization to organization. Determining what is an acceptable compromise doesn't just impact the people in that room. And so does anybody want to jump on that first?
Yeah, I mean, I have just offered the observation that if we're going to, make a concerted effort to try to diversify what we're doing here, we have to be ultimately including a lot more folks that are out there working these issues at the local level, right? I mean, I definitely think, based on what we know now, that folks in the Black Lives Matter movement or the Stand Up Don't Shoot movement, et cetera, there's no question they've been subjected to surveillance. The Intercept reported on that earlier this year. And that's a pattern. And if you actually kind of look at the history of surveillance over the last 100 years, and by the way, within the next few months, I will be publishing something that will actually show definitively that someone or groups of human beings in this country have been under government surveillance for their political views literally every year for the last 100 years. And most of the time, it's folks who are challenging the prevailing political paradigm, right? So it's your Black Lives Matter, it's your Stand Up Don't Shoot, it's your Keystone XL. It can be folks on the right. It could be Tea Party groups. We saw what happened with the IRS and Lois Lerner and so on. So I think we do have a lot of work to do in that area to try to diversify it. It's going to require a conscious outreach effort, I think, on everybody's part to try to make that happen.
Why there are no people of color? That's a daunting question. Well, I would say to add on and tie to what Pat said is that there's a fear of silencing those who speak out. And who are the people who have always been silenced? Blacks, Latinos, women in this country. And so they are rightfully fearful so, versus when a white male comes up and says the same statements, oh, okay, he's coming in to save the day. But if it's a woman of color, she doesn't know what she's talking about. She's not educated. Where did she go to school? So that fear of silencing, just like it happened for the Wilmington 10, which I didn't even learn about until I became a professional. So that's also tied to this education narrative and pedagogy. We didn't learn about this. We're not taught this about the COINTELPRO and the surveillance of our communities. And so we're kind of don't really care at that point to even get into those type of fields. But also the issue is that historically, people of color have not been they have not been outreached enough into these STEM and tech programs in which most of surveillance falls under, or people who work there have a tech background. So that's an issue and concern. But also when you think about communities of color, surveillance and people watching us, we're used to that. It's nothing new. You know, it's slavery, it's Jim Crow segregation. So it's kind of complacent, like, oh, now they're doing to all of you, okay, but, you know, so that's 1,000-foot meter. And so communities of color are more focused on the 50-foot meter, access to education, access to healthcare and employment. And so until we try to link those issues as part of the larger issue of civil rights, can we address that? Now, as Pat said, you know, I went to the Black Lives Matter Summit in New York City. We were surveilled. At the Million Man March, we were surveilled. No coverage on it. And so we have to also understand that we have to work with what historically communities have been surveilled. So now I work with Arabs and Muslim Americans who are thought of as the people who are surveilled. And so now as that community is able to work and outreach with another community of color, those are the people they need to hear from. Now, what effect does this have on lobbying and compromising and getting issues and concerns addressed? There's an insight and perspective issue that is rampant and broad in the whole civil rights perspective. You cannot, in my opinion, this is my opinion, it is hard for you to articulate issues if you never experienced them or if you don't work directly on the ground with those people. I'm from New York City, the South Bronx, Webster Projects. So I know what it is to be discriminated against. And so I can take my own experiences and share them because that's what's important, getting that human experience to see the disparate impact. But don't get me wrong, there are a lot of great white men up here who have fought for our community. And in addition, another issue with the insight is that that experience, we have different priorities on what is needed in our surveillance reform. And so we have to make sure that we are also educating our white male counterparts when they go to Congress because they have the political power or the political privilege. So we don't need to shun them. We need to work with them to get us in the door. And I think that's the problem. So I don't want to divide between like, oh, she's a woman of color, she's, you know, but I think it's just an insight and perspective. And that's all. I might add something later.
I think there is a very real reality is that we've lost some of the policy reforms that actually affect people on the ground and affect minority communities. I think if we look at surveillance, the reality is that I think, you know, like a lot of the panelists have mentioned, there have been communities of color that actually feel the effects of that surveillance and have for decades far more significantly than communities that are actually the ones pushing some of this legislation. I mean, just to give you an example, even if we look at the 215 fight, it focused heavily on mass surveillance, it focused on sort of bulk collection. There's not a non-discrimination clause in that bill, right? There might be other existing federal laws, but there's not necessarily a huge chunk of that bill that addresses the question of whether you can do sort of bulkish collection or broad collection that's targeted at a particular race, at a particular gender, et cetera. And I think that is a reflection of a deficiency within, you know, certainly parts of the privacy community of really understanding what the effects of some of the laws are. And the second thing I would say was, you know, even in self-interest, I don't think that the connection between the erosion of civil rights in other areas and connecting that to the surveillance debate has really happened. Like when we think about stop and frisk, what's 215? It's essentially an electronic stop and frisk program, right? There's no reason to stop you, but we're going to go ahead and look for information anyways. And when we look at some of the worst national security policies, they existed for a long time. They were just targeted at smaller communities, and now they're targeted at the entire population. And so even in self-interest, it's really important that we think about the Fourth Amendment and the erosion of the Fourth Amendment in all contexts, because all of those erosions just get applied to the electronic age in a way that I think is leading to some of the problems we see now.
And I'm just like to add to that, that's tied, as she sparked my thought on this. You know, DOJ issued a new guidance against racial profiling in December 2014. Didn't do much because it still allowed Customs and Border Protection and NSA and these other intelligence agencies to engage in federal law enforcement acts based upon race, religion, national origin. So we have the DOJ, the branch of the Office of Civil Rights, saying that this is okay. They're the ones who set the standard. So we need to make sure that they're setting it correctly.
Just one area where 215 connects to real lives, to the brick and mortar world that we didn't address enough, I think, is that FBI uses it to find informants. So they look at networks and they say, this guy would make a really good informant to go after this imam. And so we know, because it's in the public record, that the FBI is using it to put human beings in mosques, right? And chill mosques, but that was not part of whether that's appropriate, and the limits on that was not part of the debate. So that's just an example, I think.
And that's why we need to reach out and work with the Arab Muslim community, because CVE is essentially surveillance. It has been founded. When they went and did their pilot program in Minneapolis, Minnesota, they used already established programs that in 2007, 2009, AMCO and Scott, they used those community outreach to create databases, which they shared with the FBI, their behavior analysis unit. And so if we keep saying, yeah, it's okay because they're Arab and Muslim to surveil against them, we're all losing. The only way we can truly address and provide protections for all is to address the ones that are targeted, which is, it's going to benefit us all. Predominantly, it's been examples that have been proven with the civil rights laws that were predominantly made for blacks and to protect blacks who have now benefited immigrants and Latinos and Asians. So it's important not to say, it's okay, they're Arab, they're Muslim, they're part of the people. No, they're part of the problem. No, we have to outreach and understand that this is a surveillance issue and it's directly targeting them as well.
So I had three quick thoughts that I'm going to add for context. One, it seems to me this is also, everything that was just said is also reflected in the media. I think there's been a real hesitance from mainstream media to paint this or to bring up the racial part of this. And two, the question of who does the compromise, I really don't know enough about the context of how this particular thing happened, but one of the changes that we saw in USA Freedom from 2014 to 2015 was an extension of the material support of terrorism sentence possibility. And I just have to imagine that there were a couple people in a room at some point, and they said, well, we're gonna weaken this somehow. You're gonna give us something else to get the rest of what you want. And somebody at some point must have signed off and said, yeah, we can look at this. And I think there is a really concrete element there that we'll never see from the outside, really, but it does happen. All right, and so I'm going to cabin the next question off to just a couple minutes because I want to get to the one after that as well. This is for Pat, actually. Pat wanted to poll the audience, and I think that's fair. I'm just going to let him run with it.
So, just three quick questions, and then just some brief commentary on the basis of that. Show of hands, please. How many folks at any point, have written their member of Congress? Show of hands, please. Okay, that's pretty good. How many folks have actually met with their member of Congress, whether it's in D.C. or back in the home district? Show of hands. Maybe a little less, but still pretty close. Okay. How many folks in this room have ever given money to a candidate or a political action committee? I'm pleasantly surprised. But also, we're a little bit skewed here in terms of our sample. Now, why am I raising these questions? Why am I going through this? I worked on the Hill for over 10 years. And what I can tell you is that the level of engagement matters. It matters enormously. Writing the member, actually visiting with the member, these are kind of, escalatory steps. But I will be candid with you. I will be brutally candid with you on this point. And there are studies out there that have basically kind of looked at this, to the extent that you can. But the plain fact of the matter is that those who give money to candidates or utilize political action committees in order to advance their agendas in this country, they do better. That's just reality. That's the world that we're living in. And I'm putting this out there really as just something for everybody to kind of think about, because within this, and when you work at a think tank like I do, you get the luxury of kind of stepping back out of it, because I don't do advocacy. I'm in the education business. I'm in the pontification business. So it gives me the luxury of kind of looking at these things in a broader context. But I think if there is one